Hey there, folks. I'm Matt Hansen,
And I'm John Johnson.
and you're listening to
Planes, Trains, and Comic Books.
The podcast where we discuss favorites we've reread, both classic and new comics we want to read, and everything else in between.
And here's the comic we picked this week.
Hey everybody, just wanted you to know that this is a special bonus podcast with my co-host of the Hell Talk podcast, Hoku, because she has written a short story horror collection, and that's called My Dreadful Dreams, 13 Tales of Terror. And it is out now as of October 1st, and I did the audiobook narration for it. So if you like the sound of my voice and you want to hear me read some short horror stories to you, then definitely go check that out. It's available on Spotify currently and a couple other audiobook places, which I'll leave links to. And the physical and digital copies of the book are on Amazon. And of course, if you do end up reading or listening to it, any reviews are very much appreciated. So with that, let's get into the interview.
Hey there, everybody. Welcome back. Today we have a very special episode. I'm very excited because I'm doing a creator interview with the co-host of the Hell Talk podcast, Hoku.
Hi, everybody.
I don't know about you, but I'm super jazzed about this because Hoku is releasing her debut collection of stories, her novel, whatever you call it, book, what have you.
Creepy story.
Yeah, it's a horror compilation, and it's been very interesting because I am doing the audiobook of it. It's already completed, so
Surprise, everybody.
Hoku had asked me to do the audiobook, I guess, because, she likes my voice from the podcast, and then, of course, we do the Hell Talk podcast. So I said yes, and we found out a little bit more work than I thought, but I did finish it, and it will be releasing on October 1st. So I figured we'd do a fun interview since, the people know you from the Hell Talk podcast, and, you're one of my patrons and all this stuff. So, I just thought, hey, this would be a good way to promote it. And obviously I'm doing the audiobook, so I want people to listen to the audiobook, but also read your stories. So let's just dive into it. So how long have you been writing?
I've always wanted to be a writer since I was a kid. And I know like 99.9% of writers say that, but it is true. I was writing like random little stories when I was a kid. I actually wasn't into horror. I was into like fantasy and stuff. So I would write stories about like fairies and dragons. And I was really into twists though. Like before I ever heard of M. Night Shyamalan, I was into that like twist that you do at the end where all of a sudden it's like, what? Like my whole world just got turned upside down. So I loved twist endings, even as a kid, not even knowing that that was like a thing, like a genre thing for anything. So yeah, I took like creative classes in college. That was a ton of fun. Did a writing group with some of the other students that I was taking the class with. That was great because we got to like go over ideas, be like, hey, here's a story. What do you guys think? And we would just tear each other apart. It was so great. It was fun. Hopefully, so yeah, I know we were sometimes harsh on each other, and I hope I never said anything that was like too horrible. I never meant to be like overly horrible, but just critical. But I may have been a little harsher back then. Um, but yeah, so that was sort of like my inspiration for I could write stories. Sometimes people like it, sometimes they don't. I just have to get better. And it all led to getting this book out of my head and putting my nightmares on paper so that they would kind of stop being in my head.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Yeah. That's great that you started as a kid and were able to like actually do something with it in college and whatnot. So you said fantasy was kind of your, like what you leaned towards earlier. So how did you get into horror?
I was always terrified of anything horror when I was younger. It was like in my 20s actually. My my husband showed me the movie Shaun of the Dead. And before that, any horror movie I'd ever seen scared me shitless. Like I was terrified of tremors when I saw that at a sleepover and was like afraid for like weeks that the worms would come out of the ground and eat me. I saw like the two worst episode of X Files. I think you know which which ones those are.
One of them's got to be Home.
Yes, one of them was Home. The other one was Fluke, the Fluke guy. Like the only 2 episodes I'd ever seen of X-Files were those 2 episodes, both of which I caught on TV. And I think Home ever played once. And I happened to catch it that one time that it ever played like on TV. Yes.
Of
So
course.
absolutely terrified of anything scary, monstery, because to me all that could be real. And so I would just get nightmares all the time. Uh, and then my husband was like, "Hey, you know what? This movie is a little bit scary, but it's also funny. Like you might laugh at this. It's funny, haha." And it's British humor, so it's kind of on the dry side. You like British humor, right? And I did. So he showed me that movie, and I was like a little bit scared, but also like, "Oh, this is actually kind of funny, even though it's zombies and it's kind of scary because they're eating people, but also it's funny, it's witty and stuff." So that was sort of like my gateway drug to horror, believe it or not. Like that movie specifically was how, and then I was like, okay, can you show me something else that's also kind of funny and scary? And I don't really remember where it went from there, but that was sort of the genesis of like, oh, I could kind of get into horror. And then I started reading horror books. I had been into Anne Rice in high school, but like that was uh like I don't know, it didn't really feel like horror. Like, her vampires were like sexy and sensual. So it was more like closer to romance to me than it was like straight up horror. Um but then I read Stephen King in my early 20s. My first book I ever read by him was Firestarter, and I thought that was just the weirdest, most like crazy story I'd ever read. And so then from there I was like, what else has he written? And, oh, he's written a lot. Okay, I can read a lot of horror books by this guy. So so yeah, that was sort of my journey from like getting into scary movies, then getting into scary books. And from there, I was just like, well, I have all these kind of horrible nightmares sometimes. Maybe I should write them down.
Oh yeah, that's great. I had a very similar getting into horror story, except mine was at like 6 years old instead of like in your 20s or whatever.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah, I saw was Army of Darkness on the Sci-Fi Channel at 6 years old, which is a Evil Dead. It's the third Evil Dead movie, and that one's funny, and it was edited like for TV, so all the like really messed up parts were gone, um, and so it worked. Like I thought it was hilarious, and also was scared a little bit, and that got me into it. So similar, Shaun of the Dead. That's a good one to get into horror with for sure.
Yeah, it seems like horror comedy is a good gateway drug to like further horror down the line that is not like not comedy at all, but you kind of get introduced to it through those things. So that is interesting. I had no idea.
It never really comes up too much, but but yeah, I remember being like 6 and seeing like Bruce Campbell being like, "Give me some sugar, baby," or like, "This is my boomstick," and I thought that was like the coolest thing ever. And then there'd be like the scary part where he fights a demonite in the what is it, the well or whatever they throw him in and stuff like that. So um I just thought like I would get scared, but then it would be funny, and it was like, okay, like I kind of like the mix. So those I never really thought about it, but yeah, those movies like Shaun of the Dead or even like Zombieland or something,
Yeah, that's true.
they're scary, but they also allow you to have funny moments. Now, you mentioned that you had like nightmares. Is that why you picked short stories for this instead of writing like a just one single novel story?
Well, I had written some fantasy novels back in the day that were like these stories that I felt like I absolutely had to tell, and they involved like mermaids and stuff like that. So I had written some like long form stories in the form of novels during November when I did NaNoWriMo, which is the National Novel Writing Month. I've been doing that for, gosh, I don't know, 10 years or something off and on. And so every time I completed one, I was like, yes, I wrote a book ish. It's kind of a book, but it needs to be developed further. And I would lose interest with it and be like, oh, actually, it's not that good. Let me write another one. So after writing so many, trying so many times to write novels and just feeling like it's a lot. It's a lot to one, write it all out and then realize I have to now edit it and make it better because the first draft is never good enough. Like it absolutely isn't. So I thought, why not try like do what you would do in a novel, but just in a tiny version. And then I think reading a lot of Stephen King short stories as well, I was like, wow, these are really great. Like some of them are like, but a lot of them like pack a really good punch in such a short amount of time. I was like, there's something to that, to being able to condense an idea to just like a quick short punch that really, grips somebody, and then it's over, and you're like, and then you have to think about it and be like, wow, that was a lot to take in such a small form. So I was really intrigued by that idea, and I thought, yeah, I have like a journal that I used to keep of like all these dreams and nightmares that I would have, and I kind of was going through that and being like, what could I actually develop into an actual story? Like, what's an idea that sounds creepy, sounds like horrific, and yeah, I happened to pick some that I think turned out pretty good.
Yeah, well, I have to say you have a very vivid dream dream life, because your stories are pretty messed up and different. So so
Oh, thank you. Yes, I have horrific nightmares, and thankfully, now that I've written these out, at least they no longer plague my dreams. Because sometimes, if it would be like a dream that would be on repeat, and I would have it more than once, and like there would be some slight differences, but the same scenario would kind of haunt me, I guess you could say, over time. And so, yeah, writing them down, just getting out like a summary of what keeps happening would sort of purge it from my brain. It also allowed new horrific things to come into my head as well. But at least I'd get rid of one and trade it for another that would hopefully be less horrific. But sometimes they weren't. Sometimes they were even worse. And now I'll be like, oh, there's a new story. So that actually helped to take these horrific things that were happening in my brain and spin it in a positive way of like, ooh, that was actually scary. Maybe I could use that for something. So yeah, I just take it as inspiration now of like if I wake up from a nightmare and I'm like, oh, that was really scary. I think I can use that. If it scared me, maybe it'll scare somebody else. So
nice. You turn the negative ish into a positive kind of thing.
yeah.
Yeah,
Something like
inspiration.
that.
Yeah. Cool. Well, uh so that's good that like you got those out. And I will say, like I said, I've read all of them obviously because I did the audiobook. They're all pretty horrific. There are some like all different kinds, which is nice as well. There's a good mix of different types of stories. But speaking of like the writing process and whatnot, like what is your process? Like, how was it just that? Like you would have a dream or a nightmare and then you'd like write it down and then just collect it and then you kind of went through them and picked which ones you thought were the scariest?
Well, yeah, sometimes I would have just a random thought. So some of the stories did not necessarily come direct from a nightmare. They would just be sort of like a random thought that I would have of like, ooh, what if dot dot dot. And then, that was sort of like writing down that idea and then seeing if that could be developed into a story. But overall, it would be sort of like I have a creepy dream or a creepy thought and I write it down and hopefully build it into like more of a summary or an outline of, oh, well, what if this happened? And then what if this happened? And then sometimes they ended with like question mark, what happens next? In which case I would just kind of let it sit, see if anything develops further. And then there would come a point where sometimes I would just get that spark, or I forget what Stephen King calls it, but just that spark of inspiration and be like, this is how it should end. This, like, I found it. There it is. That like beginning, middle, end. It's complete. Oh my gosh, that's there it is. And then I develop it into like actually trying to pull it from a summary, which would have like, okay, beginning, middle, end. This is how it goes, and then write it out as an actual story. So deciding whether it could be first person or third person, deciding like when the scene changes happen, all of that was kind of new because I was mostly used to telling one long singular story. And this was more like that, but like in a much smaller capacity. So you have to be like, okay, I only have a certain amount of words to tell this story in. Like, how fast is it going to move? How slow is it going to move? And all that. So developing that was difficult, and I had to sort of like be willing to ask other people to read it and be like, hey, does this make sense? Or is this scary? Or is there something missing here that you wish you knew more of? And after listening to your podcast for a while, and especially when you would talk about like Hellblazer and all the scary stuff, I was like, he likes horror. Maybe he also likes to read books or stories. So that's when I'll like reach out to you, be like, hey, um, I wrote some scary stuff. Would you be willing to like read it and give me your thoughts? So you were very helpful in kind of being like, hey, this isn't bad. Could you like make it scarier? And I'd be like, oh, well, I could try.
Yeah, add some more blood and messed up stuff. That was my
Yeah.
notes.
Which I hadn't read things like Hellblazer. I mostly read Sandman, which has some like horrific parts to it, but things like I don't know, the crazy stuff that gets into with Hellblazer was a bit more than I had thought you could do, in certain stories. Not that Stephen King doesn't do horrific things, but sometimes the story would just be subjects that I had never come across before. So things like that, I was like, yeah, you definitely, I think, have a bit more horror knowledge than I do. So thanks to you and some of my other friends, I was able to build these stories and I think give them more meat than they originally had.
Yeah, I can say that like I did think they were pretty awesome when I first read them. Like at least you could see like even if they're ones that were like unfinished or whatever, it was like, oh, there's definitely a kernel of something cool here. So I was very happy that that you would you would every time I would make a suggestion like you should make them do more fucked up stuff right here. Like, it's like you're like, okay, and then I read the next draft. I'm like, oh, that is pretty messed up. Like, so it was fun
It was
to,
great direction.
yeah, exactly. I'm like, what if you that like this is great, but just hear me out. What if they stabbed each other 50 times? Like, like what if there was guts and whatnot in this? So, you're like, okay, okay.
Like
So
this is scary, but could you just put a little more gore in there? Just put a little more emphasis on like the death part. Like just give me more like horrific dying.
yeah, I remember specifically just being like, okay, I want to really feel this on a couple stories where like, really tell me what is happening in here because that will make it creepy for sure. So, um, yeah, it was always fun giving notes like that and then seeing what you did with it and like go crazy because you eventually were like maybe at the beginning you were like, oh, like this, and I'm like, yeah, a little bit more than that, and then, but then like by the couple once we got into the writing kind of notes and whatnot, you would take it and run, and then I'd be like, holy shit, like that's not okay, yeah, that's pretty messed up, and that's farther than I was thinking, but I'm cool with it. So, so there's a couple stories where that happens. I'm like, wow, you did a really good job at kind of pulling the taffy at this horrific scene. So,
I let
um,
my freak flag fly, or horror
exactly.
flag, I guess you could say. Horror flag fly.
Yes. And one thing I liked about the stories too, as like, someone who was a fan and got into horror through like kind of a mix of comedy horror, is that your stories have some humor in them. Not all of them, but there is like at least a couple that really stand out that have some funny moments. Or at least like moments that make it kind of quirky or weird or whatever. Um and then like yeah, there's some that have like a different types of horror in them. Some of them use like anxiety and melancholy to create like dread or suspense or sadness or whatever. And like instead of just direct like, oh, there's a man with a knife and he's gonna kill you. Like that's great. Those are great stories too, but those can get boring if you have a short story collection. And I liked that you had so many very varied stories with different types of horror and different like different ways of approaching horror that don't always get approached in these kind of um, like short story collections. So was that like a conscious thing you did, or was it just like as you were kind of writing them out, um, as far as like ideas, and then when you were like, I'm going to put these in a book, you were like, okay, this one's cool, this one I don't know about, this one, or was it conscious like that?
Not really. I was just kind of writing stories that I thought this would be kind of a cool idea, or this would be kind of a scary idea, or this would be kind of a weird idea. And it wasn't so much like I have to like write specific stories that match. It was sort of like what is it that's dying to come out right now? Because the original like beginning of this particular collection was husband was away for work. I was like, what am I going to do? It was back in, I think, 2022. And I was like, what should I do? Well, maybe I'll work on some stories. I think, friends always say, like, oh, yeah, if you're writing something, let me know. So I wrote something, I sent it out, and they were like, oh, yeah, that's actually pretty good. That's pretty creepy. And I was like, oh, I mean, I could try again. So I just went from there with, like, oh, well, here's an idea I had at one point. Let me see if I can work that into something. And as they started building up where I was like, okay, if I can come up with like 10 stories, we'll see, maybe that's enough for a collection of some kind. And so I just wrote them kind of one after the other, jumping in between them as I'd be like, hey, check this story out. I'd be writing another one. I'd get some feedback on story number one. And then, send story out number two out while I worked on story number one again. And it just kind of went back and forth like that for like that whole summer, pretty much, of just feedback changing. And by the time I think October rolled around, I had 15 stories. And I was like, this is like actually the length of a real collection. Maybe it could work. And even though not every story is the same, I still had the feeling like they flowed well together because they all have that sort of dreamlike quality to them. They all have, they're all dreadful. They're all dreams. Well, most of them are dreams. And then that's when the title clicked as well, My Dreadful Dreams. So, because that was kind of the inspiration of most of them. And I was like, "Cool. I've got a whole collection. Let's see what happens with it."
Nice, yeah. And one thing I notice as well is like, yeah, not only do the topics vary and whatnot, but like, or the type of horror, but like the intensity in some of them is, it goes from like a fun kind of like maybe like a two horror to like, even in the story, sometimes they'll go from like a two to like a seven or whatever. But like, then there's some stories that are definitely like hitting heavier topics, of like more real world things that you mix like supernatural or kind of monster stuff in. Um, like how did you deal with some of those heavy topics, and were those hard to write?
Oh, yeah, they were definitely uncomfortable to write, and I think they'll be uncomfortable to read, and I do apologize to anyone who gives these a try and can't finish them. I completely understand. If they are just, like, either that triggering for you or that uncomfortable for you, you don't have to finish them. You should, but you don't have to.
I like that. You're like, come on, you can do it.
You like, I can never not finish a story even if it is making me uncomfortable. I might put it aside, take a few deep breaths, maybe take a day or two, but I will still want to get into it to see how it ends. So yeah, some of these I definitely wrote knowing that I am extremely uncomfortable writing it. I have to get into some very horrific headspaces. Um, but at the same time, I felt like the story is still worth telling. And to me, that's important. If you feel strongly that the story you're telling is worth telling, no matter how horrific it might get, then you should tell it. And and then it is up to other people to read it or not. So, it once it's out there, it's out of my hands. You hope that people will read it. You hope that people, even if they don't like it, will understand it. They may hate it, but at the same point, if they're also like, I hated it because of this, and I'm like, that is exactly why I wrote it, is to make you feel that. So, I mean, I'm just excited to see what people say, and I also kind of secretly hope I give some people nightmares because that's sharing the darkness.
Yeah, just pass it along, I like that. All right, cool. Yeah, so once you like finished, I guess the first draft of it, right after we were done giving you notes, and you were like, I think it's ready to be published. Like, what was the next step towards doing that? Like, how do you even like step into that realm?
Well, you can decide to either try to get traditionally published or to publish it yourself. And then if you decide to do traditionally published, which I did at first, I was like, why not? It's a collection, which I learned very quickly in the literary world that nobody sells collections as a debut author. Collections are when a author who is established is like, hey, I wrote a bunch of short stories that were in a bunch of magazines or, collections or anthologies. I want to gather them all up now that I have a huge fan base, put them all together, and then throw that into the world because people now know my name. Therefore, anything I write, that people will be interested in. But when you're a debut person like me, nobody wants to read what you have to say because you have no base. You have like, who are you? What is your voice? So technically I was supposed to send these individual little stories out into the world in magazines or on websites, other collections, anthologies, and throw them all out there and get recognition that way if they got recognized, like if they actually got picked and put into publication, then I could be like, okay, cool, this story has now been published, it's under my belt. This story has now been published, it's under my belt. And that involves a whole lot of time. So I was like, you know what? I'm going to skip that process because I don't want to separate my stories. I put them together for a reason. I think they should stay together. I think this collection is solid. And either someone will believe that or they won't. And nobody did. So traditional route did not work at all for me. I looked up agents because you have to query agents who then well, submit your work to publishing houses. Most of the time, someone like, say, Simon and Schuster or Penguin or all their, smaller, what do you call smaller labels. They don't just take work from anybody. They get work recommended to them by agents. So to get into those big publishing houses, you need to get an agent. But every agent out there is being queried by like thousands of people a month. So you have to like really get their attention. So it's just, it's a whole big mess trying to get published traditionally. And I tried it. I did. I spent a whole year, all of 2020. So 2022 was writing the book and editing the book. 2023 was querying the book to as many agents as I could find that were, one, willing to take a look at horror stories, two, willing to accept collections, or three, didn't outright say they didn't take collections. So tried to slide it into their uh, query piles as well. And I ended up querying, I think, somewhere around 70 to 80 different agents or agencies and got rejections from, I want to say, 60% of them. And the rest just never replied, which is also something. Is just like, hey, if we don't contact you in 3 months, then we have decided to go in another direction, which is entirely possible. You're lucky if you get a rejection because yes, sometimes you will just get absolutely nothing at all. You get completely ghosted. They just don't have the time to contact everybody. Most agents will say that. So yeah, rejected right out. I did get some very nice, like just a couple of rejections where they're like, "Hey, I don't take collections, but I like your writing style. Submit if you ever write like a full book." So that was nice. But after going through that whole process for a year, I was like, I don't want to keep doing this. This takes a lot of effort. This takes a lot of energy. I would rather just have my book in my hands because even if an agent decides to pick you up, they still have to, you know, show your book around to all the publishing companies. Then they have to decide if they want to print it. And even if they do decide that they want it, that will take another year or two before you ever see your book on the stands. So that's a process that just can take years, just in general. And if everything goes right, if you get an agent right away, if they get it to a publishing house and they pick it up right away, it'll still take at least 2 years for you to actually see your book in your hands. And I decided that I wanted my book in my hands, like me, myself. I wanted to just have it. I don't care if I'm the next Stephen King or not. I don't care if it's ever in a bookstore. I want my book and I will put it into the hands of people that I think would enjoy it. So
Well, yeah, that sounds like
after
a
I
pretty
decided,
crazy process. Like, yeah, I fully understand that I created something and I just want to see it. And when you send it out, I mean, you did the work of sending it to like 80 different agencies or whatever. So if you didn't get any response that you want that was like positive on that, then okay, I'm just gonna go publish it myself. So um, I think that's you tried, and I think that's admirable anyway, because a lot of people just skip that part just because they're like, okay, I don't want to deal with that at all. But you got to see what it was like. It was still a learning
Yes.
thing.
I take that as I figured it would be a learning process because the odds of actually getting an agent were so low that if nothing else, I would at least learn what the process was. So if at some point in the future I ever do decide, hey, maybe this book could actually be like traditionally published novel because it hits the right marks or whatever, then yes, I knew the process is I'd be able to do it a lot faster for something that I like had more of a feeling like, yes, this could possibly work. So yeah, learning experience, that's all you can ever take from sort of like the negativities, right?
Yeah, totally. I mean, was someone's there's a quote, I don't know who said it, but there was like, you only fail if you actually like stop. So if you just were like, oh, no one wanted my book, well then
Oh, that's
I guess
nice.
I'm done. So like failure is
Yeah.
only when you actually stop pushing forward. So the fact that you were like, I queried 80 people, they were like, no thanks, and then you're like, well, fuck it, I'm gonna move forward. So I know that you hired an editor uh to do it, since obviously if you were gonna get it traditionally published, they would, I assume, hire an editor. So you had to do that since you were self-publishing. So what was that process like?
Well, so when you're traditionally published, they pay for all that stuff, the editing, the cover, the proofreading, all that stuff is paid for. So yeah, when you publish, you have to do that yourself, and you can do it all yourself, like literally yourself, like if you know how to manipulate stuff or use like programs to edit your work. But I did want to get it officially edited because I knew that even though I thought it was the best that I could do, it is possible it could be better. So I happened upon an editor in a Facebook group that I joined, which was about like writers and also allowed for like editors and agents and all sort of just a big mix of people who could give each other like tips and tricks or just, encourage each other. So I randomly saw a post by an editor who, and this was why I was still querying, she said that she had helped to revamp someone's query, and after like querying for like 90 times and with like 90 rejections after her revamp, she finally got like an acceptance of someone being like, hey, I like your query, I want to read your work. So after that I was like, well, that's really cool. So I checked out her website, and the biggest thing that the biggest thing I had to overcome was finding people who specialize in horror. It's such a niche genre. Most people are like, yeah, fantasy, sci-fi, romance, chick lit or women's lit or whatever, those different genres. Like horror is so small, even though a lot of people love to read horror and horror seems to be like everywhere now. It's so hard to find people who specialize in it. So I checked out her website, and she was specifically like fantasy and horror and sci-fi. So I was like, ooh, she actually includes it in her like tops. Because a lot of people will say, oh yeah, I do fantasy, but I can do everything. And that to me is usually a red flag for you can't do everything, but you want to. So I contacted her. We worked on my query. She helped me sort of like revamp it a little bit. I still sent it out. So that was at the halfway point of like, I think at about 30 or 40 rejections. I was like, okay, maybe I do need to like change things up. So she did help me figure out like how to make it sound better, how to get my thoughts across better. And I really do think that it made it better. Even though it ended up not going anywhere, I still really am happy that I got to work with her because I was like, "Ooh, if she can just help me with this little thing, maybe I can, keep my eye on her for if I do decide to go the self-publishing route." I really like how she works with words. I like how she works with me. She's very professional. We had a contract, she laid out everything, very easy to understand. Like I'm having a good relationship with her. I think she could also be my editor for like the entire collection. And she also read them all. So at that point, she had to read all the stories to know like how to rewrite the query because she was also including things like the summary, which is you have to summarize. Normally, you summarize a novel in like 3 paragraphs. I had 15 stories that had to be summarized into very like 2 or 3 sentences. So she helped me a lot with that. So she knew my stories intimately at that point. I was like, if she has any thoughts about how to make them better, like she would be the one I would go to. And so I did. After I decided my querying journey was done, I was like, hey, you've already read these stories. Would like, can you give me some really good tips on how to make them better? Like, what are they missing? And so she she overhauled them like completely, which was a little painful at first, like you get that far and you're like, these are the best I can do. And someone's like, you know what? You need to kind of start from the beginning and build these stories. Here's the best way to do it. Like, just give it your all and you can go further than this. Like that was the main thing she told me. Is like you can take these stories so much further. You can really give them like more than you're putting into them at this point. And I had thought I had reached my limit. So with her encouragement and her like layout of like, hey, this story, this is where you can put more into it, or this is where you can really build up this character. I was like, oh my goodness, that's a lot of work to do. But I did it.
Yeah, I remember when you got those back and it was like, hey, I'm going to have to rewrite all these stories. Will you still read them and give me notes? I'm like, yes. But you did a lot of overhaul on them. They ended up like way better than they were, and they were already good. So I think it was totally worth it to get the editor. The final stories that are, in the book and the audiobook and whatnot, like, are some of like the creepiest things I've ever read. So, and I had to read them out loud for the audiobook. So,
Oh, yes. I still get even more creeped out because I thought they were creepy to begin with, but then hearing you say those words, like, in my head was a whole new level of just like, "Ugh, this is so creepy. It's amazing."
well, I'm glad you liked it. I'm glad it turned out to your satisfaction. Um, but like, yeah, so you had reached out to me, like I said, I think once you decided to self-publish it, you were like, hey, will you do the audiobook for it since you've kind of been reading it and, you already liked my voice from the podcast. And since I do voices on that, you kind of knew what I could bring to the table. And,
That is exactly why, like, I crossed my fingers, like, I don't know if you're gonna have the time, I don't know if you're even interested, but I loved the way you did the different voices for different characters, and that was, like, a big thing of the way I heard in my head a lot of the stories beings, not just people talking, but I have some weird things in this book that I'm like, they need very peculiar voices, and you come up with some great ones sometimes. So that was like the biggest like if you can't do this, I don't know where else I'm gonna go. It was like almost an all or nothing. So it was like crossing my fingers. Please let him have the time. Please let him have the willingness to work with me on this because I didn't know what else I could do after that.
well, the funny thing was I was like, sounds pretty simple. Like I got my recording set up for, podcasts. So how different could it be? And, yeah, audiobook recording is different than podcast recording. There's a totally different level of audio quality required. So I had to do like a crash course in some new software, and like I had to build a little sound booth and like all this stuff just to get like clean sounding audio that was acceptable, like enough for an audiobook. So that was an interesting process. And then recording, I kind of thought it would be like, you know, I don't know, the same thing. Like, oh, I just read the comic like I do in the podcast, so I'll just read your book, and it will even be easier because I won't have to come up with my own descriptions of things like I do in the podcast. But it's not. There's a lot more. There's a lot more stuff involved with an audiobook that I never really thought.
Nuances.
I think nuances, but then also like I'm doing the I'm doing the narrator voice, which is just my regular voice, and then but it's also like it's not just my regular voice. Like when I do the podcast, I'm just talking like normal until I do a character voice. But for an audiobook, you got to kind of put in a little bit of not effort, but like you got to make sure you're pronouncing everything 100%, and you know uh there is like a little bit of like you want to sound official or something, so it's a little bit different than my natural voice. It's a little bit more authoritative, I guess, because I'm like, I'm the narrator. Like, so, uh, so it is like a
I
little bit
am
different in that.
creating this world with my voice.
Exactly. Yeah. I am God of this, of this book. I am manifesting these things into reality. But yeah, so that was a interesting kind of thing to find out. Um, and then the audio recording itself kind of went the same speed as like the podcast, because it, for like one issue of Hellblazer, it takes about 2 hours of recording now. And I think those episodes are about 30 minutes normally. So like around the 25 to 30 minutes. So most of your stories were around like 45 minutes or so. And, um, and all of those took around 3 to 4 hours to record. And then the longer ones, of course, took longer, but like just average, like I'd say 3 to 4 hours to record, which was what I thought it was going to be. But yeah, so it was interesting. I'm really happy I got a chance to do it. I thought, maybe this would be something I would like to do for like money on the side. And then after doing yours, I'm like, I don't think so. I think I'll just stick with your books. So, uh,
One and done.
yeah, I don't know about one. I mean, you got other books you've been talking about, but we'll see. We'll see what happens in the future. But so that's my side of the audiobook process. Now, what was your side? Like, what did you think the process would be like for you?
I didn't really know. I tried to look up like what do you do to create an audiobook, and most of the time, especially if you use a program like ACX, they're just like you hire a narrator and let them do their thing. So I was like, oh, okay. I guess I ask you to do the book and then let you do your thing. But I'm actually glad we had a bit more back and forth, like trying to figure out the voices, kind of thinking of like, oh, how should this character sound and how should that character sound? And I was actually wondering because sometimes I would have an idea in my head and then we'd go through it and it would turn out like, oh, no, that's not very good at all. Like that doesn't sound like just the right way. So what did you think about like coming up with a character voice if we just couldn't figure out like how it should sound?
Um, Sometimes, like we did like a whole run through at the beginning of like all the characters and like generally what you thought they could be. Some of them I found I could not do. Like we would talk about it and I'd be like, oh yeah, this one is a Southern person and it's a girl. So like a little girl. So I'm like, okay, I need to do like a little girl voice with a Southern accent. And I found out I can't really do that for some reason. Um, so things like that were kind of hard, I guess, to figure out. As far as voices, I didn't know what like, my limits were. One of the things that kind of surprised both of us is you have two stories that are female narrated, or the
Yes.
main narrator is the female in the story, and so I had to do a female narrator voice narrating it. So I was like, I don't know if I can do this for the whole thing, but we'll try it out, and it worked out. And yeah, I thought it turned out well. I assume you liked it, so.
Oh yeah. I mean, you not only had to do like the main character female narration voice, you had to do her voice too, like talking or thinking. So it was like technically a trifecta of a female voice of both like female narration plus female voice plus female thoughts. So I mean, it blew me away because sometimes I forgot that you were the one narrating and I just got right into the story. So I thought it turned out really good.
Oh, that's great. I'm glad it turned out. I will say, I did not even think about you have to kind of have different sounding voices for the different parts of one character. So if the character is narrating the story, that sounds more like kind of official. Like I was saying with my voice, I make it a little bit more authoritative when I narrate just the regular story. So I had to do that with her voice. And then if she's having interior thoughts, you kind of have to give that a different sound than her exterior speaking thoughts or her speaking voice, because if she's talking to someone in the story right after she thinks something, or those two things are kind of intermingled, she's thinking about something while she's talking to someone, you have to be able to differentiate that. So uh, I didn't even think about that when we were talking about voices. It was just like, oh, this character sounds like this. But then it was like, oh, there's like three characters in the one kind of thing. So just
Yeah.
having to come up with how to differentiate those things was interesting. I'd say that was probably um, something I didn't think about, but ended up turning out really well. I was surprised I could actually do that. So yeah, I definitely pushed my limits and learned something about like my vocal um, prowess or whatever you want to call it, my ability to do vocal things. So
I was worried too. I mean, like 100%, I had complete faith in you, but I was just worried if you would be like, "Hey, I actually can't do this." I'd be like, "All right, like, do I have a backup plan? No, but I could figure something out if I really need to." But thankfully, we figured out how to both play to your strengths and also allow you to sort of have like creative control sometimes and be like, "Hey, I can do this voice. Like, let's see how that works." So I think it worked out really great. And I kind of don't know how that works in the normal narration process. So if anyone out there is like thinking, "Oh yeah, I could totally just like do this back and forth with my narrator all the time," I don't know if you can do that. I really don't, because that would be like you and a stranger, and I don't know what those sort of limits are like. So ours is a very specific process. Just so you should know.
yeah, like we've been talking because I've been reading your stories for the past year, and like kind of giving you notes on them. So we had a rapport already. So it is. I don't know I don't even know how you would do that because like there were a lot of questions I had. Maybe because it was my first time doing it as well. But I had to like, hey, is this cool? What do you think about this? How do you say this word? Like, like what is this thing? This name or whatever? Like, there were some things that I had to get like your notes on before I could do a story. And then it was like, if we didn't have a back and forth, I guess I would just hand it in recorded and you would then say, no, I want it like this. And then I have to go back and redo some stuff. So I don't know.
Yeah,
I don't know. It was very unique, our situation on this.
I think so. So don't take our experience as like, "Oh, this is how narration works." This is how narration works if you know the person that you're working with and can actually have conversations with them, not just by email, but actual like contact with them, and more than say two revisions, because that seems to be sort of like, you have X amount of revisions that the narrator can make on, on your story if you're not satisfied with certain things. Sometimes that's part of the contract. So in our case, we were able to do enough back and forth that it wasn't so much about the revisions being needed. It was more just like, "Oh, hey, you said this like this. That's fine. I can change it in like the story." Because to me, sometimes if you said things a certain way, then that were like maybe a teeny bit different than the way I had written them, I'm like, "Well, it sounds more natural that way. I can just change it in the book. It's no big deal. That way you don't have to re-record it unless it's like something big that I'm like, ooh, I kind of want it this way." So that's another part that I was like, I don't know how I would do that with someone else. Like, would they like would I want to then change my words just because they've said it differently? But because we actually had the rapport, I didn't mind. So I'm like, oh, it actually sounds better that way.
I was gonna like one of the questions I had was like, was it hard collaborating with someone you know? But it sounds like that was probably easier on this on this thing.
I think so. I think both because you knew the stories, you kind of had an inkling for what they were already ahead of time. It wasn't like I dropped them in your lap and like, "Hey, can you record these?" without ever having looked at them, which is I guess how it will work in the real world with a random person that you hire. So yeah, that was definitely a different experience. And I also think that just in general, my being a fan for so long of your work, I was just really excited to get your expertise in your voices. So I was willing to just about be like, yes, absolutely. Just say it however it feels good, and I can make it work. So yeah, I think there was leeway on both our parts, I think.
Yeah, that was nice. That like I remember getting some corrections back. I'm like, okay, cool, no problem. And then you were like, yeah, I had to change some stuff, but no worries because I'm changing on my part because it sounded better the way you read it or whatever. I'm like, oh, well, that's nice because because I would imagine like if you didn't know someone and they read your like you spent all this time making a book and like you have your story and your words and and then someone goes and reads it wrong or reads it like in a different way that you didn't think. Um, but it doesn't necessarily change the story or maybe it actually reads more natural or something. And then you're like, huh, do it. Like I would imagine you wouldn't want to change it for someone else. Just me personally, if I spend all this time on my thing, I'm like, my words are God. Like you don't change my words.
Yeah, and sometimes I think when I hear an audiobook and hear the way something is said, I'm like, you know, that he probably could have said it in a way that sounded more natural, but it sounds like he said it, exactly the way it was written. And it, might have been a little clunky. So sometimes I think there should be more give. But, that's up to them. That's their choice. And I'm just glad that we were able to work in such a way that, you didn't mind if I had suggestions and I didn't mind if you read something different. And I was like, okay, that sounds good too. So yeah, I think it worked out really well.
Yeah, I do too. I think the recording process and everything went really smooth. Now I know you said you had some questions you wanted to ask me on this part about recording the audiobook, so you go for it.
I was wondering if maybe if we can avoid spoilers, but we'll see. Did you have any particular voices that you were really like, ah, yes, this voice. I really liked doing this voice, and any others that you were like, I hated this voice. I'm so glad it was over when I finished.
As far as okay, voices I liked doing the narrator in Drifters, because that one is I don't want to spoil the story, but it has a different affectation because the character is in a certain state of being. So I got to kind of do my best Dr. Manhattan impression from Watchmen. That was interesting because it was kind of like the most chill narration session because I could just be like calmly saying everything. There didn't have to be a buildup of intensity because a lot of your stories, like they start off normal intensity or just regular reading, and then slowly or in certain parts it has to get very intense and very, forceful with the saying of things. So it was nice to not have to do that. And one thing that was that I didn't realize you know, when I first started recording these was like that intensity. Some of your stories have intensity for long periods of time, and my voice would would totally start to give out after like 2 hours of the intense voice of recording. So
Did run you a little bit ragged, didn't I?
a little bit. That was like one of the harder things, and mainly because I had to go back and match it. Like if you did a correction, if you're like, hey, you said this word wrong, or like you totally missed this section or whatever, then I'm like, oh, my bad. And then I'd have to go back and try to match that intensity with the cold, without having read for 2 hours. So that was interesting and hard to figure out how to do. I ended up having to do like voice, like I looked up like how to do warm-ups, like for vocal warm-ups, like me me ah,
Oh
me me
yeah.
moo ma me me, like like trying to like just get my voice warmed up enough so it sounded close enough to like that intensity, just for those one part, that section or whatever that I was re-recording. And then the hardest voice to do was Noah in Danger. That his voice, he's got a couple different voices, and one of them was very, very hard that I didn't realize. Sometimes I do this with the podcast too. Sometimes I'll pick a voice that I can do for like 10 minutes or whatever, like, and I don't realize that I
Yeah.
can't do it longer than that until I get past that. And then I realize, well, I've already done like 10 minutes of recording and I already said all this stuff in this voice. So I don't want to go back and re-record it, but I got, this many pages of this character left. And with Noah, I just forgot that it continued longer because I think it had, you did the editing sometimes like after, like you were like, I'm done with the story now, but I had only read like a couple iterations before. I didn't read the final draft before I recorded. So I didn't realize that there was like, oh, you added a bunch more dialogue with this character at the very end or whatever. So now I have to
Yeah.
do like 3 pages of him talking in this very harsh voice that I didn't realize I
It
was
was
going to have to
such a
do.
good voice.
It is good, but I had to literally like take a couple days off just to like recoup my voice. So
You
uh,
guys need to listen to it so you can hear how much effort he put into it because it's such a good voice.
yeah, it is interesting for sure. I mean, I do that on the podcast too, but it usually, it's only one issue or it's a couple pages in the comic or something. So I try not to blow my voice out for that, and it's a little bit like if I have to change something, I will change a voice in the podcast. Like if you go back to some of them, some of the characters and listen to the first time they appeared and like later on, they sound a little bit different. And that's probably because that was too hard for me to do consistently. And since they're regular characters, I'm just going to change them to fit better, and no one's going to really notice. But with this, it's like people will notice. It's your book, it's an audiobook. It's a lot cleaner audio, so you get all the sounds correct and everything. So, yeah, it had to be. That was definitely the harshest one for me to do.
Would you say then, like the differences between doing a podcast and audiobook, does it just come down to how much effort you have to put into it?
Yeah, I think the effort for sure, because like when I do the voices, I don't think about it too much when I do the voices on the podcast because um I've read ahead like at least 6 issues, so I know who's a recurring character and who's not. And then at least in that storyline. And then um so I'll be able to like if it's just a throwaway character, I'll just pick an easy different sounding voice from John, right? From John Constantine. But um but for this it was like, okay, I know all the characters, but they're all reoccurring the whole story. They are the main characters for the most part and stuff. And
Yeah,
so
they're the stars. Like there's a lot of stars too, just in one story, and you had to come up with different voices for every story too.
yeah, that and then like um like with Hellblazer, it's like I use John's voice the whole time for every episode. So when in this it was actually like I wonder what it's like when you do a whole novel that's just like a solid one story, because with this it was like every story I had to come up with different voices. So that was interesting to like, okay, I got these voices for this one. Now sometimes I overlap, usually like side characters that don't matter. I might John Constantine definitely appears or the voice of him definitely appears a couple times in this collection.
Yeah, you guys will have to listen and find him because I was so happy. It was like a little bit of an Easter egg to be like, oh, there's John.
Yeah, it's just like an easy voice I can go to because I've done it so much. I can just like switch to it automatically. So I was like, okay, some of these characters that don't matter and it's like a male character, I'm just going to use John's voice and that's it. Or even like one of your stories specifically, there is a guy that talks for a extended period of time in the story. And I was like, okay, since I'm talking so much, I'm going to give him John's voice because I know I can do this without hurting my voice for this, this extended period of time. So, um, yeah, that was interesting to figure out and find out the differences between them. I think it's really just the amount of effort, because obviously the podcast is my thing, and not that I don't want to do a good job, but like it's a free podcast that people listen to, and podcast audio is a different level of requirement, right? So like audiobook needs to be perfect as far as audio quality. And then like people will listen to podcasts that have echo and mess ups or whatever, and they're like cool with it because
Mouth noises.
yeah, mouth noises. It's a podcast. Oh God, mouth noises. I can't unhear them. My ears, all I ever hear now is mouth noises. Um, but yeah, so like, yeah, having to go through and pick out every fucking mouth noise um, in the audiobook was definitely that technically, like the recording was fairly straightforward. The editing was what was the hardest thing of everything in this. It was um I'm not an audio engineer at all. I just, go on YouTube and look up like how to do this or that. And honestly, I have no interest in becoming an audio engineer. I'm not a big fan um, of like trying to make crisp, clean audio, and that doesn't get me off. And also, I've played drums for 30 years and my ears are dog shit. So like, I don't have the ears to be an audio engineer. Because like I've had people be like, oh, you hear this sound? I'm like, I don't hear what you're talking about. Like, like you don't hear that in the background of this track? I'm like, no, I don't. What? Like, I don't hear anything you're talking about. So, I know I don't have the ears for it anyway. Um, and so, yeah, I have no interest in doing that. That's my least favorite part of this. Cause, if you don't know, as like, at least usually I'll say like, cause on ACX, which is the Audible or Amazon recording for narrator, uh, app or whatever, or platform. I guess part of the rules are you have to be the audio engineer slash editor as well. So like, or at least most people are that are on that, the independent creators. And I'm like, no. like if we do this again, I'm like, I don't want to have to edit it again because that was like the hardest part.
Skip that mess, stick to the part you enjoy.
Exactly. And I would suggest that for anybody who's doing audio books and they don't like the editing process, I would say just get it so you can record it and, give them like finished recordings, like they have all the corrections and everything done. And then you just hand it off to an audio engineer that's going to clean it up for the client. That would be the way I would go for future things. So, because the editing took forever. Like I kept being like, oh, I'll be done this week. And then that is not what would happen. And it would just take forever. So, I was like, way longer than I thought it would be, way harder than I thought it would be. I mean, I woke up at 3 a.m. for the last 3 weeks
Oh my
to
gosh.
edit before work, just so I would be able to finish on time, which was already late for you. So um, yeah, it
It
was.
still turned out fine.
Yes, it was a lot of work, but it was worth it because at the end I'd be like, wow, this sounds really good. I'm glad. All of
It
course
sounds so good.
I do hear everything I didn't or wasn't able to get. That would annoy me because when you listen to your voice in headphones and you're focusing on the errors, like all you hear is the errors. so, so it was a thing. It was a whole thing. But I'm good with it now. Once I recorded the last one and handed that over to you, I was like, weight off my shoulders. So yeah,
It's done. It's done.
yeah. So that is my tip. If you don't like editing audio or aren't an audio engineer and don't like that part of it, don't be an audio engineer. Just pass that off to someone else or tell the narrator or tell the person contracting you. I just do the audio. If you like my voice, that's what you're paying me for. I just do the recording part, and then, if maybe you can come up with like a partnership with an audio engineer and then pass work over to them after you're done. Um, Either one, but like, yeah, if you don't like it, don't do that because that was my least favorite part for sure.
Stick to doing what you love and let the experts take care of everything else.
Exactly. And that'll, hopefully get a better product in the end as well. But so that was my experience with the audiobook. So and in the background I kind of was talking to you a little bit about what this was like, but just in general, what has the book release been like? What is like as a whole, um like all the work you had to do to get here. I know you had to, like you said when you were talking about self-publishing, you have to do everything yourself or you have to hire someone to do it. So like you got an editor, and I know
Yes.
you paid for the cover and the formatting and all that. What was that like?
Yeah, so that is one thing where people who talk about self-publishing will either say it costs an arm and a leg or it doesn't cost anything at all. And sure, yeah, if you decide to just do everything yourself, if you have those skills, by all means, it can totally cost you pennies if you really want it to. But I had none of these skills. I needed someone to edit it. I needed someone to create the cover. I needed someone to format it to look like actually a book and not just something that I threw together myself. So finding these people was probably the most nerve-wracking part because there are companies out there who will do all that for you, almost like a traditional publisher. You still pay them to take care of all that for you. The only difference is that you will pay a lot more than if you do it freelance, I guess you could say, by finding those people yourself. And sometimes those people also, like a traditional publisher, get to have some of the rights where, like, they'll take, 25% and you'll get like royalties from it. So, that's sort of the trade off with that. But because I tried to vet everyone myself, it did cost a pretty penny, which I don't think I'll ever recoup the cost of this book, but I don't care. I'm just so happy to have it out there. And I think that because I spent the money to do it, it is the best possible version that this book could be. So you find websites or you get tips or recommendations from other people who are also in the self-publishing game. I would say that a lot of the time it was almost like luck, serendipity of me just coming across the right person at the right time who is legit and also happens to be exactly what I was looking for. So in that case, it's really just keeping your eyes open, going with your gut feeling of like, this is the right kind of like, I guess I would say, that wedding dress moment. For the ladies out there, if you see that wedding dress and you're like, oh, that's the one, that's the dress that I want. Or I guess for guys it'd be like the gaming system or something.
Yeah,
I don't know.
the tux I wanted or whatever. Yeah.
The text you want. But you feel it in your gut and you're like, yes, I'm going to go with that person. And while that does not always work out for me, I will say it did. I found these people and I was like, I would like to like hire you for these services. And they did exactly what I wanted to do, or beyond what I thought they would do. And it worked out really great. So, vet the people that you find, get recommendations from other authors in your genre. That's a very specific thing. Like look in your genre. Don't just get like a fantasy cover artist to create your, western. um they might say, oh yeah, I can do anything. I don't always like recommend trusting that, because they will still have that bit of fantasy to them when you want like a serious western, or uh y- you want a sci-fi novel and they do chick lit books or something. So try to find people within the genre that you're going for, with the skills that you want specifically. Um and yeah, it's work within the time limits too, because if you're like, okay, I want my book, for me it was, I want my book out uh by the beginning of October, because that's when spooky season starts. That's when hopefully people are looking for new horror books to read, and so I can hopefully get in at that time and be there for people who are like, I want to read something new. Oh, here's my horror book, perfect time for Halloween spooky season month. So, timing that out to where, okay, how long will it take someone to do the cover? How long will it take someone to do the interior design? How long will it take someone to do the audiobook?
More than we thought.
More than we thought. Yes, that was just, there was no way to really know how that would go, because it was a first time for what we were doing. But just in general, kind of have your timelines and then give yourself some buffer, so that like, even if things go long, you've still got time to do it. Like if we thought, yeah, 3 months totally, but we still had, a good like 5 months buffer to get everything done. And even though it came down to the wire, it still got finished like before the time ran out. So it did work, because we gave ourselves more time, thankfully. And the same thing with everything else. I had some last minute like issues with the cover. It was a mistake I made. I had to go back to my cover artist and be like, hey, can you squeeze me in and just do this really quick alteration? I'm so sorry. Thankfully he was able to make the adjustments that I needed before the book comes out. So yeah, I would say just give yourself more time than you think you need, and just do as good of a job as you can at vetting the people that you want to work with.
Yeah, that's great advice. I yeah, I think the all of that is like invaluable as far as like if you're thinking about self-publishing, it is definitely a good idea to do to give yourself time before if you have a hard publishing date that you want to publish on, definitely give yourself as much time as possible, especially if you're planning on doing audiobook, all everything, and I think it's pretty awesome that you found, like you said, it was kind of luck how you found a cover artist or an editor, all that kind of stuff. Um, it just happened that you were on the lookout and those people caught your eye. And then the fact that they weren't scammers, because I've heard of a lot of, scams happening with people.
Oh yeah, horror stories. Like that's the whole nother, that's a horror genre in itself, is that the kind of scammers that will come after you because all you want to do is put your creation and like put it into a physical form, or, a digital form. And there are people out there who are like, I'm just going to take this money from this person because they're that desperate. So yeah, it was horrifying to hear the stories of people going through these situations. But I will say, a lot of the time, if you are just not so eager to get something done without doing a little bit of background work. See if this person's ever worked with anyone else before. If, like, say for my cover artist, they had a website, they had books that they had published, they had art that they had for sale. Um, Check out those books. Are they real books? Like, go to Amazon. Are they actually for sale there? See if the people who are, said that, like, the author's name is the same author's name. Just, do the at least the basics of trying to figure out if this is a real person or a scammer. I will also say that most of the time, if someone is reaching out to you, that can be a red flag.
That's probably a red flag, I would say.
Yeah, exactly. If they're like, "Hey, I can do this for your book," whether it's marketing, whether it's art, whether it's, whatever. Usually if you are still in the process of creating your book and this person randomly reaches out to you, they're either really desperate or they're a scammer. And like, that's just most likely. It is entirely possible that they are someone who's just getting into the game, trying to reach out to as many people. They are 100% legit, but the odds of that are very low compared to it being someone who is just, looking to make a quick dollar off of you. So if you're the one doing the reaching out, doing the vetting work, and for anyone who does try to reach out to you, definitely check them out. Don't just take them at face value. Do they offer contracts? Do they, uh, have a rapport with you? Are they just like, here's the deal, take it? You know, just don't be willing to do anything to get your book out, because people will take advantage of that. And yeah, so it was a lot of just learning a lot of hearing a lot of stories, learning from the mistakes that other people have made. Unfortunately, it sucks when people get taken advantage of. But what you can take from that is to learn what not to do and just be open to hearing those stories. Like, go out there, join groups where people are talking about self publishing if that's the route you want to take. There's tons of websites out there, there's tons of groups out there that will offer you all of this information where you can learn from the things that have happened, and also pick up some really good tips, pick up like really good relationships with people. And yeah, just keep your eyes open. Don't just take things at face value, and just be willing to, figure out for yourself whether it's worth going into. Just be careful out there.
Yeah, there's a lot of scammers, but doing a little bit of due diligence will help with that for sure, like you said. Um, do you have any other writing little advice to give would-be writers at all?
I would say that as much as you think what you've written is the best thing ever, even if you've gone over it, what you might say, like a dozen times, it's still good to get other people's eyes on it. As much as you are afraid, as much as it sometimes hurts to be willing to take critiques, it is incredibly important to get other people's point of view, because otherwise you're just writing it for yourself. Like, why would you want to put it out there if you aren't willing to receive any sort of criticism or, critiques, good or bad? Because that's just part of the game. If you're willing to say, I have a story that I want to put out there, I want to sell it to people, I want people to read it, you have to be willing to let people read it, even in its, like, early forms. It's super important to get outside, uh, just outside eyes on your work, because if you write it in a bubble, it won't ever, like, reach its full potential. To me anyway. Like, there might be people out there who can write a first draft and it's perfect and it's amazing, but I will say for most of us, that is probably not the case. So, like, it was invaluable to get your critiques, or other people I sent it to, because you guys would catch things that, I could never have seen. I called it like poking holes. If you could poke a hole in my story where, like, this doesn't make sense, or why would this person say that, or why is this happening? Like, you laid no groundwork for that, then that is something that a reader would probably catch and just be like, oh, well, this story is awful. So, as much as it did hurt in the beginning, at some point I was like, yeah, just give me your best shot. Tear this thing apart so that I can put it back together like in an even better, stronger way. And going through that with my editor, it was the same thing. I was like, okay, I've gone through all the edits. I'm just going to see what she has to say about this. And it was like starting from square one again.
Yeah, I remember when you first asked me to look at your stories, and then I was like starting to give you notes, and I was like, wait a second. Do you want me to like really like be brutally honest, or do you just want me to like say like it's good or bad, or like, you know, like because, you know, I don't want to hurt your feelings or something, and I wasn't sure how much feedback you wanted, but you were just like, be as brutally honest as you possibly can, and I was like, all right, here we go. Like
Yeah, I still remember this one time where, and I won't say any specifics, but there was this one part in one of the stories where you're like, I hate this. You have to change it. And I was like, thank you, for that honesty. I appreciate that. And then I changed it, and you're like, that is much better. So otherwise, a lot of other people might have hated that too. So I'm glad that you pointed it out. And I was like, yes, you know what? That could be better. That absolutely, I hate it now too. So it has to go.
there you go. I appreciate that. Yeah, it was nice being able to like actually give someone real feedback that wants it, and it didn't like ruin any like friendship we have. We didn't have to shut off the podcast. Like no more hell talk because because I told you something wasn't good.
Can't even be civil with each other. How dare you critique my work? You asked me to. Yeah, well, I didn't expect you to actually like give me like horrible advice.
Yeah, I just wanted you to say it was awesome. That's what I thought you were going to say.
Right? Yeah, no, especially with the early drafts. Uh you need someone who's willing to be honest with you and say, "You know what? You can do better." That is the most important thing, I think. My editor was the same way cuz she's, you know, really was like, yeah, do you want me to be brutally honest with you? And I was like, yes, give me the honest truth. Like, is this the worst thing you've ever read, or can it be made better? So she said, this is not the worst thing I've ever read, but it can be made better. And I was like, sweet, like, give me all the details. What do I need to do? And I will say that I've had some early readers who have said that this as a debut is surprisingly well written. And I credit that to both you and all of, the people I've had help me with this, as well as my editor, because I think a lot of self-publishers, and it really comes down to funds. Like, do you have the funds to put all of the extra work that are needed into this? And editors are crazy expensive. They can be crazy expensive. So I was able to financially like invest in this thing, and I think it shows. I think it shows that, my editor was able to help me with it, and I have had good feedback for it. So I'm really proud of it. I'm really proud of it for being the best that I could do for this book.
Yeah, I think it was totally worth it as well. I mean, I liked the stories before the editor told you to rewrite everything, but like when she, when you came back, even she, I remember you saying that she said like, oh wow, you've like leveled up because you did all the changes she kind of was talking about, and like you leveled up as a writer. So, and I could definitely tell that, especially when I was doing the audiobook and I was reading these stories kind of uh the newest versions for the first time, we'll say. And I was like, oh, like, yeah, these are freaking awesome. So that was very, very cool to get to talk to you today. I will say there's a little teaser because you kind of mentioned this at the beginning, but you had 15 stories and this book only has 13. So,
Oh, right.
yeah. So I kind of know this, but I believe you're planning on working on one of those stories into a novel. Is that correct?
Yes, I'm hoping that my next book will be an expansion of one of those stories into maybe a novella, hopefully a full novel. We'll see. I'd really like to explore more, and specifically because my editor said that there was more there than I could really do in a short story. She felt that the world itself was bigger and needed more detail in it than I was putting into that story, and I could either take a lot more time to enhance it to the point that she thought, it needed to be, or I could take it out and work on it either in another collection or expand it into something bigger. So I took her advice and took that story out. Plus another story that after she kind of gave me all these tips, I was like, this story too, there's more there than I'm giving it. And so I took both those stories out, and I'm hoping that my next book will be this expanded story. Yes.
Nice. That I can't wait for that. Can't wait to read some of that. I'm gonna take a break from reading your stuff for a couple months, but then when you're ready for me to look at it, I will definitely check that out again. Um,
Yeah, I won't hit you so quickly with these. I know you need to rest your brain a bit, get some distance.
yeah, for sure. But very excited. Like we said, this comes out October 1st, at least the book and the digital and physical book. And then the audiobook will either be out that day or that week, we're assuming. So, but yeah, so thank you very much for joining me today. And of course, as always, you can check both me and Hoku out on our Hell Talk podcast, where we discuss the chapters of John Constantine that I have just read on the main Hellblazer podcast. It's in that same feed, but they're labeled Hell Talk. So if you liked me and Hoku's banter back and forth, check that out. If you want to listen to me read audiobook versions of Hellblazer, you check out my Hellblazer podcast as well, which is John Constantine, a Hellblazer podcast. And with that, we will see you guys on the next one.
Thanks so much for having me. See you later, guys.
Bye.